this just lists some of the projects I've been involved in, but there are colleagues in Sprue and in STEPS who've been also involved in projects relating to grassroots innovation. For me, it began looking at this project supporting and harnessing diversity experiments in alternative technology, and I wanted to understand the history of what I was calling kind of green niches in the UK and how they developed over 40 years and related to more kind of conventional systems of food. So I looked at organic food in relation to intensive agricultural and industrial food systems, and similarly eco-housing in relation to the volume house building sector. And then I met a colleague who was doing similar stuff at the University of East Anglia called Jill Seafang, and we said, well, let's just put a conference on in London and get folks along. And we called it Grassroots Innovations for Sustainable Development without really thinking too much. It's just a nice sounding term. And it struck a chord with lots of people. We developed it, we put in, after several attempts, we got some money together to do a project on community innovation in sustainable energy as an example of what we meant by grassroots innovation. Again, looking in the UK in this case. But around that, realised that there are other people who'd been using this term for many years, such as Anil Gupta of the Honeybee Network in India, and I'll come to that in a bit. But the aim of today is to sort of draw on this work. In the STEP Centre, I should say, there's this project on grassroots innovation movements, which some colleagues call the Inclusive Innovation Project, because inclusive innovation has become the latest term that's animating people like the World Bank and the OECD. But we're not looking, we've been able to speak to those debates and what do you mean by inclusion in terms of its form, its depth, its process or outcomes in relation to innovation activities. But we've been looking at grassroots innovations predominantly, and those we take, as I'll explain in a bit, to be innovative ideas that come up and practices that come up from local communities, really. Okay? And so we've been looking at a number of networks and movements that have formed over the years to try and promote that sort of activity, okay, to make it easier for people to figure out solutions for their problems through their own organisation, okay, and mobilise resources, maybe help from outside, to do that kind of development. So that's the aim. So within the STEP Centre, we have this project called Grassroots Innovation Movements, and we've been looking across and writing about a number of movements and networks. So the Honeybee Network in India, the People's Science Movement in India, the Social Technologies Network that existed in Brazil for a while and has sort of dispersed a bit now. Historically, looking at the appropriate technology movement in South America. The original aim was to look at something quite contemporary and not something that's either was historical or longer standing, okay? So that's why we were looking at the appropriate technology movement in South America, which flourished in the 1980s, just to try and compare or contrast, or just as a bit of way of thinking a bit differently about some of the initiatives that are happening now. Obviously, times change, places change, so the roles that historical analysis can play in the present are very particular. We could talk about that. And then in the kind of more UK or European context, I was looking at a movement for socially useful production that came out of grassroots trade union activity in the UK in the early 1970s, 1980s. And then more recently been looking at the flourishing of maker spaces, hacker spaces and fab labs, and this kind of in Europe and, well, globally for that matter. Adrian very usefully in the preceding presentation included some kind of grassroots innovation examples in his introduction to innovation. He mentioned car clubs, for example, so I don't really have to go through this long list. The interesting thing with car clubs, of course, is not only that it blends the appropriation of high technologies like web platforms and automated booking systems and sharing systems that really help these clubs flourish from you phone the person up who's got the diary and they note down, is the car free on Saturday afternoon? Yeah, okay, that's great, put me down for it. That kind of system that began in places like Zurich in Switzerland, where some of the first car clubs originated. So this much more kind of online, much more convenient way of doing things. But it also professionalised and scaled up as well, obviously. You have major car rental companies buying into these car club initiatives, okay? Now that's fine, and it's a market that's working, But for some of the people who are involved in car clubs, you kind of lose some of that community basis and face-to-face activity that was a motivating issue. It's an interesting question with grassroots innovations that scale and professionalise and commodify is what gets lost about the grassrootsness. What kind of conversations are no longer possible? If car clubs were part of a wider sustainable communities initiative and they become a wider scale club that you join, what sort of opportunities for other local sustainable development capability building gets kind of lost by that? You know, you get a broader, thinner sustainability perhaps, but you lose some of the depth. Now, that's not to be normative about these things, that's just part of the dynamic, I think. And then it's interesting then, as you see, for example, with the history of organic food in the UK, similar process. Supermarkets, large growers, governments got interested in organic food as a response to various food crises. And they helped it develop to go from a very fringe muck and magic activity done by hippies to something where you could get organic frozen ready meals in supermarkets, okay? But it changed through that scaling and commodification. It went from a very holistic local form of agriculture interested in the health of soil and what the health of soil consequences would have for the plants and the livestock, etc. And there's also how we consume them, to something that was essentially agricultural production of processed foods with synthetic chemical-free ingredients. Yeah? So it's changed, its sustainability's changed. But also there are reactions against that. It's been very interesting in the UK. That, welcome as that new market possibilities were, you've also had a flourishing of local vegetable box schemes and local agroecological initiatives, born as a reaction in part out of that experience of mainstreaming. Okay? So there's very interesting dynamics that push it forwards. And the people involved in these things are, you know, either support for different reasons. I mean, it's not like you have to kind of just be into the vegetable box scheme. You know, you can go and buy what you can from the supermarket, that's great, and then you also maybe do your box scheme. I mean, it's all part of this sort of diversity, but the point with the diversity is it's in interaction. And sometimes it's about synergy and appropriation, and sometimes it's about contradictions and resistance or reactions as well. Okay? So that was a kind of tangent out of some of these examples. The other point about coining a term like grassroots innovation, I mean, it's a bit like the term innovation itself. If it's so, whilst it's very helpful to have it, it's very broad. It's such a diversity of things. You know, you're talking about very different things. So if we're moving to a definition, what do they have in common? What do they hold in common at heart? So that then we can begin to kind of compare them or look at them as a class, as a group of things, if you like. And I think Jill and I, borrowing work from Patrick Devine-Wright and Gordon Walker, looking at community energy in the UK, thought this was quite a helpful way of thinking about it. Grassroots innovations occupy the sort of top right quadrant of this axis, which is based on, is the process of developing the innovation open and participatory, or is it closed and institutional? Okay? And are the outcomes of the innovation, the benefits, but also the risks that are borne, are they predominantly local and collective, or are they distant and private? So we think grassroots innovation ideally is very kind of open and participatory in the processes of developing solutions, innovations, and also in the outcomes. Okay, not if, so you might contrast that. As I'll come to talking about community energy in the UK in a moment. Since we're in the UK, I thought I'd talk about some grassroots innovation here. But you might contrast that with a community-owned wind farm or wind turbine, you know, the process of developing it, the benefits, put it in that top right quadrant, okay? A utility-operated wind farm, okay? Quite closed and institutional process. The only chance the communities get is maybe during the planning, getting planning permits. They can accept it or reject it. And the benefits, the outcomes flow to in the UK, to the kind of HQs of the utility companies or the developers of the wind farms, okay, which tend to be very distant from the hills where them wind farms are put in place. And it's interesting in that case how that involvement in processes and outcomes, as research by Patrick and Gordon have shown, really affect the acceptability of the technology, the wind turbine technology, okay? And also questions about the scale of the turbines. Obviously with turbines, the amount of power and therefore profit you get from each sweep of the turbine is related to the cube of the length of the turbine. So if you make the turbines bigger, it's a cube increase in power. So there's a lot of pressure from a commercial point of view to make these turbines as large as you can, okay, given the capital you've got to invest. But maybe from a community development point of view, you want to keep your turbines relatively small, and obviously there is a market in smaller turbines. But you know, the dynamics of technology development and the influence that these sorts of drivers face are very important. So, for example, the Centre for Alternative Technology in Wales, when they wanted to replace their turbine on their hill, they had to buy a second-hand turbine because they couldn't find one of that sort of size on the market. So, this quadrant, yeah, and then as a kind of definition, a working definition, we said, I'm afraid it's at the bottom, which is tricky for you at the back, but so grassroots innovations involve networks of activists and community organisations generating novel bottom-up solutions to their sort of development needs as they identify them. They tend to respond to the local situation and the interests and values of those involved, and interestingly often neglected by innovation policy, okay, which is often framed around rent-seeking firms, okay, working with knowledge producers. And I think that's what got Jill and I into this, actually. We sort of saw that in the back whenever the sustainability literature seemed to have kind of local environmental action on the one hand, certainly in the UK, European context, okay? And that's good, and how do we promote it? And then there was sort of like sustainable innovation, but looking at firms, research, ecological modernisation, these sorts of questions. And what kind of sparked us is actually there's a lot of innovative stuff going on in this local environmental thing. So we were just simply trying to bring it together and, yeah, finding that there wasn't a lot of policy interest. And I think that's true today as well. I mean, the inclusive innovation debate's quite interesting because it does seem to be taking some of these sites of innovation seriously. But what the consequences are for the institutions of science, technology and innovation is not that clear or not really kind of considered. It's how can we integrate this ingenuity into our innovation systems rather than how do we need to transform our innovation systems and bring them down to the innovators, the grassroots. Maybe we'll come back to that in a bit. So what sort of stuff are they generating? Adrian gave some examples. I mean, the sorts of things that grassroots innovations activities, certainly in our experience and trying to study and understand this thing is, yeah, they generate artifacts. So it might be the kind of water-cooled fridges that we saw. The kind of in India, the Honeybee Network have been supporting a potter who developed a kind of clay fridge that's water-cooled called the Mitty-Cool fridge, I think, and helping him to become an entrepreneur who can then sort of sell these fridges on the market. So there are artifacts like that. It's also methodologies. Looking at the movement for socially useful production in the UK, who wanted kind of human-centred technology development. They were trying to resist the first wave of automation in manufacturing, essentially, and turn these new tools to socially useful purposes. They pioneered a lot of the techniques for participatory design. Okay, so the idea of using mock-ups, of including different groups and so forth. So actually grassroots innovative activity can also generate methodologies, new ways of going about organising. New actors are created as well. Grassroots entrepreneurs, okay, knowledge brokers. There's a whole plethora of and various intermediary organisations, which we'll come on to, that are created in this activity. Infrastructure and facilities is created sometimes as well. And we talked about car clubs as a kind of, these kind of infrastructure created. But something I'm researching at the moment, these sort of fab labs and hacker spaces, which are essentially community workshops where people can access design and manufacturing tools to make stuff, to make their own prototypes, whatever they want. If it's a present for their grandma, or it's their own home energy monitoring system because they don't want to be part of connected to the utility system. But you're kind of giving these tools to people, and that's kind of new infrastructure. Now, what people make of that, is up, we see, in the circumstances. Just because you provide this stuff doesn't mean that everyone's going to embrace it. And, we need to think more deeply about that, how communities of users build around these things. But anyway, you do get infrastructures coming out of these sorts of things. Think about the kind of alternative food networks. And farmers markets and so forth. Okay, these are new infrastructures for the marketing of food in certainly in a context like the UK, where markets were very much declining. They've kind of rejuvenated that sort of infrastructure. And then there are policy innovations as well. The idea of launching prizes, mentoring programs, actually figuring how to access this messy, awkward, complex world of grassroots folks. They don't have offices in London to go and talk to the innovation minister. They're not there at party political conferences. So if you really and they're often volunteers as well, so they're working during 9 to 5. So how are you going to access them it's not trivial. It actually says a lot about the presumptions and attitudes towards in policy. But what novel policy mechanisms and fora are required to access this stuff? Okay, and I think ideas like funds are quite an interesting way of trying to begin to do that. And then concepts and ideas emerge from this sort of stuff as well. So this idea of commons-based peer production, thinking of knowledge as a commons rather than something that can be a commodity or that can be traded in. Yeah. New business models as well. Okay, if you're not making money on your proprietary knowledge, then what do you make money out of? How do you sustain these sorts of activities by providing new services? How do some of the values get transformed into exchanges that support your livelihood? So the value of being inclusive, of being there in your community, etc. Yeah, how does that transform into a kind of maybe not necessarily into finance, but into something that's going to support livelihoods? Okay, because it's a very intangible thing at the moment. I need to keep an eye on time. Okay, now I'm going to say a few things about how one way that we've been trying to approach this or conceptualize it, okay? And it's just this idea of the kind of niche spaces, what's going on. This is bubbling up in the gaps or wherever there's possibilities where these kinds of more oppressive kind of regimes for energy, the supply of electricity through a handful of regulated utilities that operate very centralized electricity systems and influence key decisions about the infrastructures that underpin that, and where users of electricity are not only assumed to be passive consumers, they just get the electricity and pay for it, but it's reinforced by that kind of regime as well. So where are the spaces to think about and do energy differently as a kind of community energy project, okay? And so the dots in this diagram are kind of the localities to do projects that try and maybe do energy differently, do food differently. And then we think, to what extent do they start talking with each other then, and networking and helping one another out? Okay, so those are the connections. And then it's sort of, how do you expand the space for doing this to make it easier for another group to do it? So, if you think about, renewables or solar photovoltaics historically, their niche setting, on a technical point of view, was very far from grids, okay? So in space initially, on satellites, in villages in Africa and development projects, in remote telecommunications bases, okay? To provide a little bit of power to keep that thing working off the grid, okay? And then they kind of, as you develop the technology, you think it through, it then begins to move into wider and wider settings. But it's not simply that. What are the sort of social settings where you think that decentralized energy or PV is a good thing? Because compared to, certainly in countries like the UK, it's not, it's not as reliable or cheap a form of electricity. Yet a lot of people have been willing to try it out and put it on the roofs of their homes and connect it to the grids and so forth, with policy assistance in many cases. But so how does this space for innovation that might be more open in its participation, that might be more kind of socially just in its aims, how does that space expand? Okay? And then we're particularly interested in what are the policies or intermediary organisations that are created to try and help these groups or spread the word, if you like, to kind of disseminate knowledge that's being generated in these initiatives. Okay, so by maybe channeling or accessing funding and support, by helping projects network and partner, maybe not just with other grassroots groups, but with other actors as well, like how to work with your local authority. There's interesting on community energy, interesting partnerships are emerging between community groups and utilities. And with the community groups, are sort of trusted access point for some of the sustainable initiatives that the utilities are struggling to kind of embed in towns and villages around the country. And then there's a kind of lobbying and activism, trying to change policy, trying to change political debate, trying to change industrial strategies or ways of thinking about innovation, trying to redesign innovation programs so they're not exclusively about firm-based innovation, but they manage to, that some funding gets channeled to, or access to university infrastructure or whatever, to enable groups to sort of work. None of this works smoothly, but this is the sort of things we're interested in seeing. What are the experience of this? Where's the kind of friction involved in all this? And what are the challenges? Okay. Another way of looking at this that might speak to what Johan's going to say this afternoon is, if you like, this is the same diagram but just turned up, and it's how that networking and connecting of groups turns into a kind of trajectory or a pathway over time. Okay, so you have these very located projects carried by local networks, great deal of variety, but then you get some aggregation of knowledge and learning and experience. Okay, and that forms through people get together at conferences, they chat online, platforms are created, and certain shared rules or problem agendas, shared sort of sense of what community energy is about, how can we help it grow, what's so difficult, what are the difficulties of starting a project, keeping it going, expanding it, or just keeping it going and not worrying about expanding it because we're not interested in that or whatever. Yeah, that suggests a certain pathway, and what one literature is called an emerging technological trajectory. But it's all, and then how does that sort of knowledge then go back down to make it easier for the next project to establish itself? Now, within that sort of niche development might be, how do we create markets? I mean, given the way our economic systems work, that's a very important way of spreading these things. So how do we turn what might have started out in life as a grant-based community development project into a social enterprise? And how do we develop markets for community energy? Or how does community energy sell into the big electricity market? Which is sort of what's happening here in the UK. So in our research, we've been interested in, okay, well, what kind of gets selected and why from this knowledge, okay? How does it kind of become a kind of codified, shared, a kind of field for doing grassroots innovation? And then to what extent does it feed back down? How easy is it, to sort of transfer that back down to a wider variety of settings and communities? So that's why we've been particularly interested in intermediaries. And with this slide, I just wanted to illustrate a couple of the intermediaries we've been looking at, okay, before I kind of look in on some of the kind of what happens within community groups in the case of community energy, okay. But within STEPS, we looked at the honeybee network in India, which emerged in the late 80s, was very much about trying to bring recognition to all this kind of grassroots activity happening in rural India. The kind of, some of the traditional knowledges and practices that were being carried out and conducted in these settings, okay? And they had Shodhyatras. Adrian Ely went on one a number of years ago, just walking around villages, learning, identifying innovations. The interesting thing with this is also that the Anil Gupta and the Honeybee Network have been very, very skillful in creating and getting support to create sister institutions that then, such as the Grassroots Innovation Augmentation Network, GIAN, and the National Innovation Foundation, and even attracting interest and sort of legitimacy from the Indian government for that this is a very vital, innovative resource in India, and we need to support it, okay? So providing through Srishti and universities facilities to develop the innovation, to improve it, to make sure it meets standards on the market, to provide the business training or skills and the investment to help this grassroots innovation flourish, okay? So the model there is, and this is something that Anil Gupta is very particular about, for him, grassroots innovation starts in the the village or in the communities, okay? And then it moves out. It starts on the inside and then it kind of moves out to broader application, if you like, okay? Social Technologies Network in Brazil that emerged in the early 2000s, and it was suspended in 2012, was a little bit different, and maybe in some respects a bit like appropriate technology before. Here the movement is from the outside in, if you like. So there are lots of very well-meaning engineers, a lot of people actually who had experience of some of the initiators of this experience in the first wave of appropriate technology. But you go and you take your knowledge and your tools and your devices and your skills and you work with the communities involved, okay? But the point is, with this, the stress was the community or the people you work with, they're in control, okay? They get to decide what maybe the design criteria are and how to use things, ideally, okay? An interesting example there was the Cisterna initiative for rainwater harvesting, which was a sort of self-build rainwater harvesting system. And it was very successful. You know, lots of the families and communities built their own interseasonal rainwater harvesting systems. And that displaced reliance upon water tankers in the Sertão, in the arid northeastern region of Brazil. So you were kind of liberated from this reliance on water vendors, okay, and the sort of patronage that went in with that. And it was your water system. It wasn't relying on the mayor to come and build something either. So for some of the more radical ends of the Social Technologies Network, that was very important for them. It was not just about providing a fix or a technology, it was about developing community capabilities and so forth, so that people could maybe feel that it was possible to fulfill your aspirations, okay? So it wasn't just about water, but it's quite a slow process. You know, going and working community by community with the self-build. Even though people build for themselves, it takes time. And so there was an attempt, and it did happen, to just sort of give people ready-made plastic rainwater harvesting tubs and systems, which obviously accelerates things, although some of them didn't withstand the heat in the region and buckled and what have you. But if you like, stripped away some of these more empowering aspirations for that project. And indeed, there were protests in one of the towns in the region, the, what's it called? One of the kind of civil society organisations for the region protested this and were able to get the self-build reinstated. And as I understand it, I could be probably wrong, but they coexist now, okay? I mean, Cisterna is much bigger than that. This is an interesting instance. You know, it's also been putting in systems for schools and public buildings and so forth. But the main point with these examples is you know, thinking of grassroots, is it coming from the inside out or outside in? And so that's quite important for what I'm going to try and squeeze in over the remaining time, is looking at this sort of intermediation, this sort of activity. There's sort of three perspectives, I think, on this grassroots innovation. There's three ways of understanding it, promoting it, supporting it. The first is if you like, what Honeybee Network, where the angle they come from, this grassroots ingenuity perspective. Okay, there's this as Anil Gupta says, you know, people might be resource poor, but they're knowledge rich, okay? There's no shortage of ideas, and it's people innovating for themselves, and the challenge is to help them do it better and to inspire others to kind of do it as well, right? The second perspective is this kind of grassroots empowerment perspective, which may be a little bit more akin to the Social Technologies Network, okay? Which is, you know, it's about including people in innovation and development processes, okay, and helping them develop their capabilities. So ideas, things may be coming from the outside, but it's the recipients who are in control. They're the kind of gatekeepers for this. They shape how it's deployed, etc. Now, it doesn't map quite like that. I mean, within these sort of networks and movements, often you've got aspects of both in place at the same time, and there's lots of arguments about what should be priorities and so forth. But if you like, we think it's helpful to think about those two perspectives. And then there's a third perspective that we found at the bottom here, unhelpfully, which is a kind of structural critique perspective. And this is all nice stuff, but it's in the bigger scheme of things, it's tiny, isn't it? You know, they're trying to solve problems whose root causes are deeply, deeply structural, okay? You know, if it's about poverty or about a lack of sustainable communities in wealthier countries or places or whatever, you know, the root causes are about the criteria for making new investments in production, you know, it's about the way people, you know, the trades or firms where people are trained and how people, what kind of jobs are valued. It's about kind of, I don't know, channels that influence our kind of aesthetics and consumer choices or so forth. You know, there's a lot of this, you know, culture, politics, economics, you know, those, unless you tackle them, then this is just a drop in the ocean, yeah? But you can kind of turn that around, if you like, and you can kind of raise the, you know, the old sort of anarchist slogan about be reasonable, demand the impossible, because in doing that, in doing your projects, that actually, they're rarely a complete failure, although Alvin's probably found some that are, but, you know, some good comes of these things, if you like, as well. The movement for socially useful production in the UK didn't change manufacturing, didn't get the human-centred technologies it wanted, didn't get the democratic cooperative enterprises it was seeking. But as I said, it pioneered participatory approaches to design. It actually inspired a lot of critical thinking about technology that we draw on in the STEP Centre today. So things kind of percolate out. But also, more importantly, straying off the point there, is in trying to do these projects, you make some of these structural impediments more visible and manifest, if you like. It's just being alert to them, as we'll see with some of the community energy examples that I'll come to. So even there, if you like, you can use the criticism of this stuff as actually that's a good thing. It's good that we identify limitations to grassroots innovation. Let's think about that. Are they problems inherent to what the group of people are doing? Or are they problems that actually speak out to the wider economic and political systems? You know, who should be responding to this? Yeah, let's let well, maybe we shouldn't be supporting grassroots innovations. They're doomed to failure. I'd argue not. But maybe some of the important lessons and what we look to need actually, that's not the audience. They're not the ones who have agency over this stuff. It's elsewhere. And if you like, you can see this sort of undercurrent of grassroots innovation in that kind of critical light. They're pointing to possibilities and asking probing questions about incumbent regimes. Even if they don't have the power to change that themselves unilaterally, nevertheless, it's fulfilling an important service to us all, I think. So formalizing that, the niche, that arrow diagram, we can think about it a little bit more deeply, if you like. We can, as a lot of literature talks about in strategic niche management, so these processes and the projects on the ground are seen as all about improving the performance of these new niche solutions, okay? They're obvious, self-evident, sustainable solutions. Of course you'd want to make them better. Of course you'd want to back them and help them spread, okay? And so the niche developments, those sort of arrows, what lessons do you extract from the experience? What do you try and codify or turn into the purpose of this pathway? And then also what do you kind of assistance do you provide to the next project? Are all about seeing projects as demonstrations. Knowledge is very instrumental about improving the performance of these sorts of projects. Intermediaries, as organisations and actors, they disseminate good practice. And politics in this is quite rational and objective. It's okay, well, how do we make this work better, more efficiently? Okay, how do we make it more effective for greater varieties of people? But of course, not everyone thinks this is a solution that matters. This isn't how I see sustainability. Yeah, it's nice, but you know, why should we support it in the first place? You can show it's improving, but it's not really the sustainable solution that we think is important. You know, might be a kind of minister thinking about energy policy, and why should I back community energy? Yeah, it's great, it's getting better and easier, but you know, nuclear is really where it's at, isn't it? You know, so there's a niche policy advocacy task here as well. Another way of looking at niches is the kind of outward-oriented work, looking beyond that arrow to convince more people that your solution does matter and your way of looking at the world and providing solutions is important. So here, the role of all these projects is to articulate and exemplify a kind of narrative, if you like, about what sustainability is about or what sustainability could be, okay? So you're articulating advocacy that and this is evidence, this isn't just something we've kind of plucked from a a conference paper or been just talking about in the pub. This, people are implementing these ideas now. In fact, these ideas are coming from this activity. Yeah. So we need to advocate for it to be taken seriously and to get support from policy or from enlightened investors and so forth. So here, the projects on the ground exemplify narratives. The knowledge is about arguing, it's more argumentative, about arguing about what matters rather than what needs to be improved. Intermediaries lobby. They don't just help one another in a technical sense, but they, groups in a technical sense, but they lobby and represent them, okay? And the politics here is much more pluralistic and argumentative, arguably, okay? Trying to win your share of support for sustainable innovation. And obviously these two complement each other, okay? Because the more you get strategic niche management improving the stuff, the easier it might get to advocate. But often that narrative work has to align with prevalent, the sort of discourses that prevail in policy or in society now. Okay, so for community energy groups now, they've had a lot of influence in the UK. A year ago, the government launched a strategy for community energy. It wants to see something like 5 million homes powered by community electricity by 2020. Quite an ambitious sort of plan. But in order to win that influence, this has had to be presented as a social enterprise. This is a way, in a very small way, but of seeing community groups as, I don't know how they think this, but like opening up markets, introducing more competition, introducing choice. People can join their local energy cooperative rather than just paying the bills to the utility or what have you. But they have to scale up as well, yeah? So it's not like community projects matter on their own terms. You're having to present it to this sort of wider policy discourse about being a social enterprise that competes in a market that has potential to grow and become larger scale. Okay, it's quite different to thinking about it as a community development project with energy as a sort of focal point for improving cohesion in the community, or heating your village hall, in a sustainable way. Something maybe more just a different way of looking at it. And then that sort of policy advocacy game, if you like, then has consequences for strategic niche management. So what kind of lessons are you looking for from these projects under that view? You're looking for lessons to make it easier for social enterprises to develop. Again, I'm not making any kind of normative judgments. I'm just saying that that's the sort of knowledge that gets emphasised. And the sort of knowledge about community development, who's involved, who's included in these things, that kind of gets bracketed out or is secondary, okay? So how you work the advocacy has influence on the pathway that the niche development follows. The third perspective is this more critical one that I was saying earlier about, okay, you reveal the structures that impede, and it's informed by critical theory. You make them manifest, you make them real, and then people will kind of mobilise to transcend them in some way. But really the aim of these projects is to unsettle and debate innovation conventions and mobilise. Why is it that a local commons like wind or sunshine is only available to those with capital, yeah? Which is how it works in a country like the UK. Yeah? It's only those who can invest in turbines that get access to the power in that wind flow. Yeah? Why is that? Why shouldn't it automatically be a resource for the community that it's blowing over? That's to kind of live with it, So how might you need to think about projects and the investment for those projects and give that to these local communities? What other ways are they thinking about energy, okay? Maybe community energy project experiences can inform that sort of discussion and debate. So here, the projects are all about challenging norms, okay? Challenging the normal way of doing things like energy or food or water provision. It generates knowledge about social structures, okay? Intermediaries create spaces for this kind of critical reflection, or they may try and link people up and mobilise them, okay? And politics here is much more antagonistic, okay? It's not about plurality, it's about challenging hegemony, and it's much more radical, okay? Now, that's quite, it's easy to say, that's quite nice. What we found with our research into community energy, definitely, and I think actually in other domains, is the first two are quite open and you can see. This second one's much more muted. So community groups, they do talk about these things in their conferences and what have you, but they also need support from government. They want to try and win more support from government, so they're quite muted about it. So you have to have research methodologies that allow you to listen to these quieter knowledges and points of view. And it's, and actually people are so, even if it was able to be more open about that, people are often volunteers or working incredibly hard on poor resources, and they're just knackered. They can see the bigger strategic issue, but they haven't got the energy and time to do it. So who does carry that kind of critical knowledge? I think that's one of the problems with kind of maybe critical theory more generally. Okay, so that's the framework. I'm going to try and run through some examples of community energy initiatives in the UK, so specific local initiatives, and then we'll come back to this, and maybe as part of the discussion you can say, okay, well, what sort of knowledges do you think came from these groups and that feature in these sorts of different ways of thinking about niches and pathways. As a bit of background, so community energy, yeah, it kind of fits in that quadrant. Our aims with the project were to understand its development and diffusion, the challenges and opportunities, and offer some evidence-based recommendations. The development of the strategy was quite timely for us because we could go and give seminars and feed into that process. Not that all of our, we sent postcards to every MP, postcards from Community Energy with some key points in it. Not that got a lot of traction with, some things got listened to, other things not, but that's fine because we're just researchers, we're not policymakers. So community energy in the UK has undergone quite rapid growth in recent years. Looking only at renewable energy projects, Walker identified around 500 of them in 2005. There was a thing called the Energy Share website that also looked at energy demand reducing projects, okay? So there's a sort of supply of energy community projects, and then there's also projects in the UK very concerned about energy demand and how you make homes warmer using less energy, basically, these sorts of questions. How do you transform the energy consumption side of things? And then there's also projects that are about awareness raising and trying to get discussion and make people think about energy in their lives more. Anyway, Energy Share, which looked at that wider kind of set, found about 5,000 groups active in 2011. And as part of the background to the government strategy, DEC being the Department of Energy and Climate Change, who've launched a strategy, they did a survey, or consultants did a survey for them that identified 5,000 projects. And there's really incredible variety. Energy generation, efficiency, behaviour, different technologies. PV's been very popular because there's been policy to support PV, but people have also been interested in hydro, electricity technologies, draft-proofing your homes, making it the wind blow in less, improving the windows and things like that, all sorts of activities. I'll illustrate some in a bit. And intermediation has changed and evolved over the years. So it began very much with information exchange and technical advice and kind of mutual support, to some development tools and networks, developing things like toolkits to help you get through the planning process, the things you need to do to get permission from your local authority to do your project. Okay? Or carbon calculators as well. How much carbon emissions is your project going to save? There's kind of a template on the website, and you put in some of the variables, and it tells you you're going to be saving so many kilograms or tons per year. Then you've got policy advocacy developing, and now some policy support feeding back from that, business partnerships, special legal services. There's groups that provide legal advice. So how do you constitute yourself as a community energy group, for example? Or what about insurance? Okay? Or if you're getting money from the community to invest in this project, how do you do that in a kind of legally robust way? So there's sort of specialist services emerging as this sort of niche grows. Professional services. And the sort of policy narratives of how this has been able to connect to the strategies of government is by meeting these sorts of issues, raising awareness of sustainable energy issues in communities, okay? Increasing engagement in behaviour change initiatives, okay? Beginning to try and use energy in a more efficient way and reducing carbon emissions. So if you like, community energy needs to be able to kind of sell itself to government as a solution to these sorts of policy agendas, okay? So that's the background. Now I'll run through 4 examples if I've got time. Maybe I'll say a little bit about them because I want to allow time for discussion. The first, this is South Wheatley, and this was a kind of community turbine set up. It's a village in Cornwall in the southwest of the UK. Happened in the early 2000s, and the idea is that the kind of revenue by the electricity is sold into the grid, and the revenue helps the village do other kind of energy activities. But it was a project that kind of struggled. There was opposition locally. The community was not a kind of nice cohesive thing, yeah, let's all do it. There was a lot, of tension involved, including the proponents of the turbine receiving phone calls late at night telling them, okay, so if you like, there's a kind of micro-politics of what's going on in the community and how people understand the landscape there, okay, where it's okay for the landscape understood as a working farming landscape, but as soon as you start putting energy technologies onto it, they don't like that kind of some people don't like that kind of transformation to energy, or they're not convinced about sustainable energy. So the project kind of surfaced a lot of issues and discussion within the community, and actually had to be scaled down as a result. Okay, so what we did a dozen case studies, as well as various other methods like surveys, interviewing intermediary actors, content analysis of toolkits and various things in this project. But with the dozen groups we worked with, we did innovation histories, which has become a method that we've used in the STEPS project on other energy things. And that's basically producing, you can't see this, but you'll be able to zoom into it with the slides later. We did a timeline of all the sort of successes and failures and challenges over time. And we kind of wrote a narrative on the basis of that and produced these innovation history documents where, as well as the narrative, there was comments on one column from the participants we've been working with who were reconstructing the history of their project, and then researchers with some analytical points down the other column, and just to try and get a kind of multi-voiced account of each case study, yeah, and give that back to them and talk it through with them as a kind of co-produced record or document, and that they can then use as well. So in this history, there's some key points I just want to flag up in this. Essentially, just trying to site a few turbines on the edge of the village to make green electricity. First, as I said, there was strong opposition. So the project had to be scaled down, okay? So this emphasis on scaling up, fine, but you may actually cause some trouble amongst communities by doing this sort of project in the first place. So scaling up's not that easy necessarily. You've got to think about the community dynamics. That also meant that there was no hype around the project. I mean, they got their smaller turbine up there, but they didn't want to kind of crow about it. They didn't want to celebrate it because it was a sore point in the village, okay? So this strategic niche management stuff about sharing your lessons, I mean, we would, I guess that's what we were doing as research. We were kind of intervening and sharing lessons about how important community dynamics are. But certainly the practitioners themselves didn't want to broadcast how great their project was, because the neighbours would, just stoke up once again all that kind of resentment. There were technical issues, okay? The turbine broke. I think the manufacturer might have gone out of business in this case, I'm not sure. But anyway, the after-sales service wasn't great, put it that way. But they were fortunate that in this case, the community had a retired engineer amongst the team of people who were doing it, okay? And he was able to understand the problem and find someone who could come and fix it, okay? But not every group has, I mean, actually in community energy, there's quite a lot of retired engineers involved in projects because they like to do that, they have the time and the knowledge. But not every community has a retired engineer as civic-minded as that, perhaps. But it's another important point, you can provide technical information and what have you, but people also need to want to and feel confident enough to act on it. And they can do, but you might need to hold their hand along the way if you haven't got a retired engineer there already. And then also a tenacious champion with these sorts of setbacks, and we saw that again and again in the projects we looked at. It is really hard to do this stuff, and you need leadership can be important, but those leaders are also made. They're not, you know, and it's the community, it's the group around them that kind of support that and bring things into play, and you encourage one another and so forth. And that's quite a common sort of thread. Barley Bridge, which is in the north west of England, in the Lake District, they had this old weir, okay, that kind of, the weir just sort of slows the flow of water so that you can get a pool, okay, and it's a very ancient weir, and they wanted to put an Archimedes screw, sort of micro hydro sort of turbine, again to generate electricity. Okay, this is on hold. They haven't done it yet. They're still trying. Actually, they're advising other groups to set up turbines, you know, who've been able to do it because circumstances were more fortuitous for them. So it was initiated in 2012 and put on hold. And despite the best efforts of the group, you know, it just didn't sort of happen. But that doesn't mean it's a failure, okay, for reasons I'll show you. The reason it was put on hold is they did feasibility studies. They got funding to look at the flow of the river, look at the technology. They learned about hydro technologies, and they worked, so yeah, this site could generate so many kilowatt hours of electricity a year. It was feasible, you could go for it. Okay, so how do we implement it? And that's when they learned that the weir was owned, the person who owned the weir, the landowner, just wasn't interested, okay, at all. So negotiate, do you want a share of the money then? Just come on, you know, no, don't want to do it, don't want to do it. So, you know, it's a question of land, ownership, you know, and they just couldn't get beyond that. But a group had formed who were interested in sustainability issues, and they just channeled their energy into other projects. So they linked up with other groups who were doing energy projects. They did food projects, and this all helped boost the kind of credibility of the group as someone active and having a track record and so forth. But they still couldn't overcome this ownership issue, okay? So again, it's sort of, some of these initiatives don't operate in isolation. In this case, the community are interested in sustainable development of their village. And okay, the hydro project, we put a lot of energy in, it'd be nice to do it one day, it's not working, but we'll do other stuff in the meantime. There's a portfolio of things. And then often they're working between different kind of institutions then as well. So in this case, you know, they had to speak to the Environment Agency that regulated the river, but also speaking to the people who own the electricity grid as well, and the local authority about planning. And none of them own sustainable energy as an issue. You know, they might be interested in helping out, but there's no champion within the organisations. So these groups are having to move between them, and it's a tortuous negotiating process. So in other words, the structure of institutions for local development do not work in the favour of, you know, that's a limitation they were up against, and they were creating knowledge about that. We need to reform the governance structures here to make this sort of thing happen, if we want to make it happen. Now, there was floods, and the weir got damaged and was being threatened a few years later, and there was a Save the Weir campaign, and this gave the project a new lease of life. So, okay, if we need to rebuild it, then why don't we put this turbine in as well then? And I looked online, because we lost contact with them yesterday, and I think it's being repaired, but they're still not going to get this turbine in, unfortunately. So maybe one of your conference activities could be to mobilise and help these people out. Yeah, so that's another example, okay? But as I say, you know, the weir didn't happen, but the kind of group processes and dynamics and some of the capabilities and thinking and awareness that developed from that did succeed. It went on to move on to other projects and do things, okay? Brighton Energy Co-op is the third example. This is a cooperative. You can buy a share in the cooperative. I think the minimum is £300. So there's a question about who can afford it, who can participate or not. But anyway, to make the economics work, that's the sort of minimum share they determined on. And basically they install solar photovoltaic PV panels, solar photovoltaics, on spaces in Brighton. And then obviously the cooperative is cooperatively owned. They raise the investment money through launching shares to become members of the co-op. The cooperative members then get a share of the revenues generated, but also there's an aspiration and some activity that some of it is also then used for other kinds of local energy activity. Okay, one of the founders in this, Will, this was born of the disappointment that he felt in going to Copenhagen for the COP, when that, he said, well, okay, we can't leave it. This is too important to be left to negotiators and all that circus. I'm going to have to go back to Brighton and do things for myself. This is how we do it. And they, so yeah, you can see here, it began in June 2010. They set the co-op up. There's lots of public meetings. There's lots of interest. Okay, let's go and do it. They learnt about PV. They learnt about how to connect to the grid and all those sorts of things. And as I'll say in a moment, they experienced numerous setbacks. But now they're at the point where they have 5 sites, some of them very large on industrial warehouse sites, over 700 grand invested and have capacity over 250 kilowatts. Okay. Now that may not be a lot, and that's something we could talk about. Again, in the big schemes of things, they're not really having much impact in terms of electricity feeding into the grid, but they've had a lot of impact in terms of within the city, I would argue. And again, this sort of softer consequences and arguing and thinking about energy. And they became very, they lobbied a lot, and I think they were very instrumental in getting government interest in community energy as a sector that's worth growing and developing. So, one of the first sites they tried was Sussex University. When I first met Will, he was really pissed off. Because he'd been spent weeks and weeks talking with the estates people here, saying, you've got all this roof space, why don't you just let us come in and put panels in? You don't have to worry about it, because I know you're not interested in that. And you'll get a kind of share, we'll do some sort of deal. And then estates looked at it, and this is Will's side of the story, okay, is that, yeah, that's great. Actually, we think we'd like to do it ourselves. You can't have our roofs, okay? So it's free consultancy. They're volunteers trying to get this thing going in their own time, on their own expense. And then the estates here had some, it's nice sort of cost-benefit analysis. This all looks kind of good. And I don't know if, I didn't come on your tour yesterday, but there's no PV panels here. Estates haven't got round to it yet. But obviously Brighton Energy Co-op have been putting the panels up elsewhere. But that was really difficult for them. It took a long time to get credibility. I think the first roof space they got was a church who was like, yeah, this resonates with our values. We're willing to support this, okay? And then it moved from there. They tried the local authority as well, but it was very difficult to get contracts with the local authority because they weren't a kind of going concern. They weren't an established business to contract with. So they had to then constitute themselves as a cooperative formally, but they still didn't have the track record. So there's a sort of a sort of chicken and egg type of situation, getting so far to do that. But again, that's access to institutions. That's a valuable lesson. We need to think this stuff through. They had to scale down ambitions, okay, because of these setbacks. Okay, we'll just find any roof space, even if it's just like tiny. It's a start. Then also they had to put things on hold, and there were setbacks because, as with anyone doing PV, whether you're a private household or a utility company doing field-scale solar farms, the incentives to doing it economically were that the government had a feed-in tariff. There was a sort of a kind of essentially a subsidy from electricity consumers to promote PV. Okay. But there were various reviews that had very little forewarning, announced sort of overnight, that kind of like, we're going to review the tariff and with a view to halving it and dropping it. But they weren't kind of scheduled. And this kind of really disrupted PV rollout in the UK generally, but also particularly, including this group and this project. Okay, it's like, we're just about to do this. Literally, I think in the first project and share launch, they had a friend at the Department of Energy who phoned them up and said, don't launch tomorrow, there's some big news coming, which was this review of the feed-in tariff. So they didn't, and then they had to kind of redo all the calculations and think, okay, how much money do we need to raise then to do that? There are also wider benefits, though, in that the price of solar panels was kind of plummeting, which is part of the reason for triggering the review of the subsidy. But obviously, that kind of wide-scale manufacture of these panels and the cells in China was beneficial to this very local project. Okay, so how, again, we were talking yesterday, I think, about these sort of interscalar kind of activities. This is the final one. Carbon conversation. I thought this is interesting because this is a bit like Alcoholics Anonymous, okay? Well, Transitions Town's got their model from AA, didn't they? But, the steps to recovery. In this case, it's how do I become a lower energy consuming, lower carbon emitting individual? So Carbon Conversations is a facilitated series. You set up a group of neighbours and you talk about energy, carbon, and some of the immediate actions you can take over series of 6 meetings. Interestingly, informed, the lady who set this up was really interested, I think a psychologist by background, and what's his name? Someone Levin. There's a psychologist who wrote maybe in the 30s about group dynamics. There's a certain thinking around group dynamics helping people kind of change individually. And that informed the design of this. But also the awareness that some of these carbon calculators on the web, so you kind of put in the numbers and you tell whether you're good or bad. I'm going to fly to this kind of workshop or summer school. How many carbon, should I offset it or not? And that's it, but it's just a tool for that. And they thought, well, we could use this as a basis for discussion. So this is not just a kind of an accounting tool, it's a kind of group self-educational, autodidactic kind of tool, okay? So that's the basis of what they do. And then they set one up in Cambridge, and then they got some funding to run them in others. And the idea is that if you want to set one of these things up, you can come and you can be trained as a voluntary facilitator and run it. You get the package, the materials, the videos, etc. And you kind of get your friends or neighbours together, and you do it. So again, some important points in the innovation history. Rereading the carbon calculator tool, I said. It spreads across the UK, But interestingly, it's easy to kind of share guidebooks, videos and stuff, but the sort of softer skills about how to facilitate a discussion, how do you kind of politely deal with the person who bangs on and on and on about their perpetual motion machine that they've designed, or something like that, That's less, well, I suppose you can try and codify a bit, but ultimately there's some tacit, hands-on knowledge and also help that you need to ground any technique. Growth slows due to kind of burnout of people and it becoming, difficult to kind of replicate this sort of thing, okay? So that's kind of classic thing with some grassroots activities, how to sustain these things. But also within the initiatives, and this is a really interesting piece of critical knowledge, I think, is the participants found that, I brought my energy down 15%, my emissions 20%, but then they were hitting limits and beginning to talk about how energy demand and carbon emissions are designed into the infrastructures of their daily lives. There's not much more I can do about my home to make it lower energy, or I can't change where I work. The economic geography of where I live and work is, it's asking a bit much for me to move right next door to there, and it's casualised employment anyway. I don't know where I'm going to be working in 5 years' time, so I have to travel, and the transport system's like this. What else can I do? I can ride so far, but no further. And so this became raised, if you like, and it's not a failing of these initiatives. It's more, then there's a discussion about, well, hang on, the government policy it's individualising responsibility for carbon emissions and energy demand. It's promoting all this behaviour stuff. It's trying to nudge, use nudge psychology to get us all to be a bit. But who's putting pressure on the house builders and where's the kind of collective action kind of policy on this? There is stuff there, but this begins to generate that kind of critical knowledge. And I don't know, we didn't ask, we're interested in that. To what extent groups then, if you follow the trajectories of people passing through this, that's something we haven't been able to do, and then, well, what kind of activities do they then take up or not? Are you just thrown into despair, or do you try and do something about it? Okay, there's been some examples, okay? I've talked a bit about the energy strategy. So the question really, therefore, is how do these three perspectives on community energy in the UK, it's something for you to think about, okay? So what kind of instrumental knowledge is being created in these initiatives, how to do projects, how the technologies work, there's evidence of that in there. Niche policy advocacy, certainly in the case of Brighton Energy Cooperative, look, these unscheduled reforms to policy supports, Some of the other initiatives, so always calling meetings in London on a weekday during office hours, you know, these are all very unhelpful, you know. We need to advocate, take them lessons and get them to change the way that the wider system works so that community energy can fit into that more easily, if you like. So there's some you know, that perspective is quite helpful as well. And then I think the critical niches stuff as well, you know, some of the bigger challenges that this grassroots activity is making very visible in a very practical way is there as well. Not only are there plural pathways, but for any given pathway, obviously there's different ways of looking and approaching it, okay? And I think it's important to listen out for some of those sort of quieter issues, if you like. Often when there's a rush to scale up and build momentum, let's not kind of bracket out some of the trickier kind of questions on that relate to, you know, social justice or sustainability in a more rounded sense.